This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to our exploration of a term capturing the heartbreak and resilience of a generation, the rotten tail kid. Emerging from the shadow of China's real estate crisis, this metaphor describes highly educated youth who, despite years of intensive investment, find their careers stalled. Today, we'll trace this phenomenon from the high-pressure world of chicken blood parenting to the harsh realities of a shifting economy. We'll examine the psychological toll of being labeled unfinished and how families are reclaiming human value from broken blueprints. Join us as we dive into this profound cultural shift. Chapter 1: The Haunting Metaphor of the Rotten Tail Kid. The landscape of many Chinese cities is punctuated by a specific kind of silence. It is the silence of the rotten tail building, vast concrete skeletons that stand as monuments to stalled dreams and financial ruin. These structures were meant to be the crown jewels of a family's investment, the physical manifestation of decades of labor and savings. But when the capital dried up or the developers vanished, the cranes stopped moving and the rebar began to rust. For the families who poured their life savings into these pre-sold units, the rotten tail building is a haunting symbol of a promise unfulfilled. In 2024, this architectural tragedy found a new, more intimate application. The term migrated from the world of real estate into the living rooms of millions of families, giving birth to a viral and deeply polarizing label, the rotten tail kid. This transition is not merely a clever bit of internet slang. It is a profound cultural shift that redefines the relationship between education, employment, and the very concept of a successful life. To understand the rotten tail kid, one must first understand the weight of the tail. In the context of a building, the tail, way, refers to the final 5 to 10% of construction, the plumbing, the wiring, the windows, and the interior finishes that make a structure habitable. Without them, the building is useless. When applied to a generation of young people who have spent over a decade in school, it suggests that despite years of construction through the education system, the final stage, employment and independence, has failed to materialize. They are built, but they are not delivered. They are high-achieving, degree-holding adults who find themselves stuck in a state of perpetual incompletion, unable to transition into the roles that society and their parents once guaranteed. The word rotten, lun, in the Chinese context carries a visceral sense of decay. It is used to describe food that has gone soft and foul, or wood that has lost its structural integrity. To apply this to a child is to suggest that something fundamental has broken down. It implies that the years of intensive parenting, the injecting of chicken blood, have not resulted in a vibrant, energetic adult, but in a state of stagnation. The linguistic choice of rotten tail carries a specific cultural weight because it implies that the child is a project owned by the parents. In the traditional view, the family is a corporate unit, and the child is the most important asset. To call a child rotten tail is to suggest that the family's most significant venture has failed to pay out. The intensity of this parenting style is captured in the term jiva, or chicken blood. While now used to describe hyper-competitive parenting, the term has a bizarre historical origin. It stems from a 1960s medical fad in China, where people believed that injecting fresh chicken blood directly into the human body would provide a massive surge of energy and cure chronic ailments. While the medical practice was eventually debunked, the metaphor survived to describe parents who inject their children with a relentless schedule of tutoring and extracurriculars. The irony of the rotten tail phenomenon is that the chicken blood has fermented. The energy has been spent, but the destination remains out of reach. The scale of this generational stall is reflected in the sheer volume of the 2024 graduating class. A record-breaking 11.79 million students entered the labor market this year, arriving at a time when the economic engines that once swallowed up graduates have begun to sputter. The youth unemployment rate for those aged 16 to 24 stood at 17.1% in July 2024. These figures represent millions of individuals who are effectively stalled, caught between the intense academic rigor of their past and the stagnant reality of their present. Consider the experience of graduates like Zephyr Cow, a master's degree holder who represents the peak of academic construction, yet found himself returning to his hometown to face a market that no longer knew how to value his advanced credentials. This sense of disillusionment has birthed a viral and cynical online response regarding the nation's birth rate. A popular joke describes a citizen who is willing to have a baby, but not a ready-made one. Instead, they want a futures kid. In this arrangement, the government pays a 200,000 yuan down payment to cover the initial costs of raising the child. Crucially, there is no guarantee of final delivery, meaning the kid might rot Lan Wei before completion. If the child fails to become a productive, tax-paying member of society, the parents are not held liable for the failed investment. This dark humor perfectly parallels the real estate crisis, where homeowners are left paying for apartments that may never be finished. The phenomenon of the rotten-tail kid is not a monolithic state, but is often categorized into three distinct phases of rotten-tailing. The early stage occurs when parents realize their child is not academic material and decide to cut their losses, stopping the expensive cycle of tutoring and extracurriculars before the investment becomes too heavy. The middle stage typically manifests during high school or university, when the student lies flat or loses all momentum, unable to sustain the pressure required to reach the finish line. The late or end stage is the most visible. The child successfully navigates the dragon gate of the Gaokao and graduates from a university, only to find no job waiting for them. They become a finished but empty building, structurally complete and highly credentialed, yet devoid of the professional purpose they were built to fulfill. This economic suspension has popularized the concept of full-time children, 全职儿女. In this arrangement, the home becomes a sanctuary where the harsh winds of the labor market cannot reach, but it is a sanctuary built on a foundation of mutual disappointment. The graduates return to their parents' homes to perform domestic chores and provide companionship in exchange for room and board. They are performing the labor of a servant in the house where they were supposed to be the master of their own future, effectively turning the family home into a temporary shelter from a world that has no use for their competitive edge. The psychological impact of this state cannot be overstated. When a building is left unfinished, it becomes a blight on the neighborhood. When a life feels unfinished, it becomes a source of internal rot. Many young people describe a feeling of hollowness, where the years of intense pressure to succeed have left them with no internal sense of purpose once the external goal of a job is removed. They are the products of an education system that taught them how to compete, but not how to cope with a world that has no use for their skills. This sense of being a failed product reflects a world where the traditional markers of adulthood, marriage, home ownership, and career progression feel like luxuries reserved for a vanishing few. For generations, the social contract was simple. Work hard, pass through the Dragon Gate, and you will be rewarded with a stable life. This was the blueprint that millions of families followed. But as the labor market shifts, that blueprint has become obsolete. The kids are finished with their part of the deal, the studying, the testing, the graduating, but the tail of the project, the part where society provides the opportunity, remains unbuilt. This leaves them in a state of haunting suspension, living in the concrete shells of their own potential. The rotten-tail kid is not just a victim of a bad economy. They are the result of a cultural obsession with a single, narrow definition of success. The investment-heavy model of parenting that treated children as a path to family glory has hit a wall of economic reality. This generational stall is fundamentally reshaping the Chinese family unit, as the metaphor of the rotten tail building provides a framework for understanding the transition of the child from a source of pride to a source of financial and emotional burden. If the child is the building, who is the developer? And what happens when the capital for the project finally runs out? To understand why the term rotten tail kid has struck such a painful chord in the collective consciousness, we have to look at the people who built the structures in the first place, the parents. In the architecture of modern life, many parents have unwittingly adopted the mindset of a high-stakes real estate developer. They don't just raise a child, they launch a project. They see their offspring as a high-yield investment, a construction that requires massive upfront capital, rigorous oversight, and a belief that the final market value will justify every sacrifice. This is the logic of chicken parenting, or jiwa, a cultural phenomenon where parents inject their children with the metaphorical chicken blood of ambition and extracurricular intensity. But like any developer who over-leverages themselves during a property bubble, these parents are discovering that the market they were building for has fundamentally changed. The financial blueprint for these jiwa projects is staggering. According to recent data on the cost of child-rearing, the average expense to raise a child from birth to age 17 in a Chinese family is about 538,000 yuan. If you extend that to university graduation, the figure climbs to 680,000 yuan. In top-tier cities like Beijing, that number reaches nearly 1 million yuan. When compared to the per capita GDP, the cost of raising a child in China is roughly 6.3 times the average income, one of the highest ratios in the world. For many middle-class families, this isn't just a lifestyle choice, it is a total allocation of resources. They are not just buying books and clothes, they are financing a speculative asset that they hope will secure the family's future status. However, even within this culture of intense spending, there are warnings of over-leverage. The famous education consultant Zhang Shuifeng has proposed a crucial financial rule for families. Education spending should never exceed 1/3 of a family's total income. Yet, in the heat of the jiwa boom, many families ignored this boundary, treating education not as a sustainable expense, but as a speculative all-in bet. They believed that the more they poured into the foundation, the more stable the eventual skyscraper would be. This developer mindset begins at the very foundation, often before the child can even speak. Parents look for the best school district housing, often paying exorbitant premiums for cramped, aging apartments simply because they are zoned for prestigious primary schools. This is the first major capital injection, akin to securing a prime piece of land. Once the land is secured, the construction begins in earnest. The schedule of a 5-year-old is managed with the precision of a project manager. The costs are specific and punishing. One mother reported spending 150,000 yuan on grade 12 tutoring alone to ensure her child could clear the final academic hurdles. For those aiming for a global track, the price of premium materials is even higher, with international school tuitions reaching 230,000 yuan per year. In the height of the jiwa boom, parents weren't just investing money, they were investing their own human capital. It became common for mothers to quit high-paying corporate jobs to become full-time study companions, effectively acting as the on-site foreman for the project. This all-in strategy was based on a simple, if flawed, economic assumption, that the return on investment would be a high-paying job that would justify the decades of construction. They believed they were building a luxury skyscraper that would be the envy of the city. This mindset has even led to a strategy known as opening a small account. In the world of online gaming, players often start a new character, a small account, if their main character is ruined or underperforming. In the context of the 3-child policy, some parents have adopted this logic, having a second or third child when the big account, the first child, appears to be failing to meet the high expectations of the jiwa project. It is a form of portfolio diversification, a way to hedge against the risk of a single rotten tail outcome by starting a new development project on a fresh plot of land. However, any seasoned developer knows the danger of the law of diminishing returns. In the world of Jiwa, this is known as the Jiwa efficiency decline. In the early stages, the kindergarten and primary school years, the investment seems to pay off. A child who has been drilled in English and math early on will naturally stand out in a standard classroom. The parents feel a rush of validation. The building is rising fast. But as the academic levels get higher, the parents' ability to directly influence the outcome drops. By the time a child reaches advanced middle school math or high school physics, the parents can no longer act as the lead engineer. They have to rely on expensive outside contractors and the child's own internal motivation. This is where many projects begin to stall. The intensive pressure applied in the early years often results in a psychological burnout that developers rarely account for. If the child's internal drive hasn't been fostered, they become like a building with a weak core. A contrast to this high-investment, soft model can be found in the story of table tennis star Wang Nan. Despite her wealth, she famously used a washing board to teach her daughter grit, making her scrub her own clothes to build internal resilience rather than relying on external capital. This hard construction stands in stark opposition to the Jiwa model, which assumes that every problem can be solved with a more expensive tutor or a better school district. The financial strain of maintaining these projects is also becoming unsustainable for many families. As the economy shifted, the middle-class income that financed these ambitions began to fluctuate. When a parent loses their job or a business venture fails, the education budget is often the first to be scrutinized. This leads to the phenomenon of education supply cutting. Parents who were planning to send their children abroad or through the international school system are suddenly forced to pivot back to the traditional domestic track. This is the human equivalent of a developer stopping work on the 50th floor because the bank called in the loan. The child is left in a state of educational limbo, having been trained for one system but forced to compete in another. There is a specific kind of heartbreak in these stories. Consider a mother from Xi'an who planned a global future for her son, enrolling him in a bilingual kindergarten and planning for an international high school. When the family's economic situation shifted after a divorce and a salary cut at her workplace, the dream evaporated. Her son was moved from a small, elite classroom to a crowded public school. He couldn't adapt to the new environment. His grades plummeted, and the mother's once high expectations were replaced by a grim acceptance. She eventually told him to forget about studying abroad and just try to get a local degree, saying it would be better to save the millions of yuan and just give it to him as a salary later. This is the developer deciding to cut their losses and sell off the unfinished project as scrap. The tragedy of the Jiwa project is that it treats the most unpredictable thing in the world, a human life, as a controllable engineering task. It assumes that if you follow the blueprint and provide the funding, the result is guaranteed. But children are not concrete and steel. They are organic, changing, and often resistant to the plans laid out for them. When a building fails to meet its specifications, we blame the architect or the builder. When a child fails to meet the parents' expectations, the sense of failure is mutual and devastating. One father's poignant quote captures the essence of this failed development. "I dug so hard for so many years only to find an empty mine." This is the voice of a parent who followed every rule of the Jiwa handbook, spent every yuan they had, and sacrificed their own quality of life, only to find that the gold they were promised, a stable, high-status future for their child, was never there. The mine wasn't empty because the child didn't work hard. It was empty because the mountain itself had changed. This obsession with the return on investment has created a generation of parents who are more like investors than caregivers, and a generation of children who feel more like assets than individuals. The bubble has burst, and the landscape is now littered with these unfinished lives, each one a testament to a dream that was too expensive to build and too fragile to survive. As families look at the reality of their investments, they are forced to confront the fact that the developer mindset may have forgotten to leave room for the people who were supposed to live inside the structures they built. If the construction phase was this punishing, what happens when the building is finally finished but the market refuses to move in? Chapter 3. The Devaluation Trap, when the social ladder stalls. The economic reality facing the record-breaking wave of graduates is not merely a temporary cooling of the labor market, but a fundamental reconfiguration of the social contract. While the previous chapters explored the metaphor of the rotten tail kid, the engine driving this phenomenon is a structural mismatch between demographic momentum and a shifting economic landscape. For decades, the expansion of higher education was the primary vehicle for upward mobility. But that momentum has now collided with a stalled economy, creating a degree devaluation trap that has turned the university diploma into a symbol of diminishing returns. To understand the scale of this mismatch, one must look at the long-term projections of human capital supply. The decision in the late 90s to dramatically increase university enrollment was a successful strategy for upgrading the nation's workforce during a period of rapid growth. However, that expansion has reached a point of saturation. Research indicates that the supply of graduates will continue to outstrip demand until at least 2037, with the annual number of graduates expected to peak at a staggering 18 million in 2034. This is a demographic tidal wave meeting a shrinking shore, where the sheer volume of credentialed labor has stripped the degree of its scarcity value. The economic engines that once provided a reliable path for these graduates have faced a series of unprecedented shocks. Perhaps the most significant was the double reduction policy, which effectively dismantled the private tutoring industry. This sector was once a massive employer of new graduates, providing a vital bridge between university and a professional career. When this bridge collapsed, it left millions of generalist graduates with nowhere to go. Simultaneously, the technology and finance sectors, once the ultimate destinations for the elite, have shifted from aggressive expansion to a focus on cost reduction and efficiency. Tech giants are no longer hiring for growth. They are hyper-focused on extracting maximum value from workers in their 20s with the intent of cycling them out by the time they hit the 35-year-old threshold. This creates a brutal bottleneck where entry-level employees are expected to arrive with the skills of veterans, yet they are viewed as disposable assets with a strictly limited shelf life. This environment has birthed a pervasive sense of unfairness, as the social ladder is not just cooling, but becoming increasingly rigged. Graduates are discovering that merit alone is often insufficient in a market where radish recruitment, or relobochalping, has become a common frustration. This term describes job postings tailored so specifically to the qualifications of a well-connected individual, often the child of a manager or official, that they are effectively closed to the public. When the number of high-quality roles shrinks, nepotism and guanxi fill the void, leaving those without connections to fight for the scraps of the formal economy. Even the traditional safety nets are beginning to fray. In response to the volatility of the private sector, graduates have flocked toward government positions in a phenomenon known as exam fever. However, the iron rice bowl is no longer as secure as it once was. Local governments, facing their own fiscal pressures, have begun significant staff reductions. Henan Province recently announced plans to cut 5,600 positions, while Shandong is cutting nearly 10,000. The very sector graduates are fleeing toward for stability is itself in a state of contraction, leaving them caught between a volatile private market and a shrinking public one. The result is a brutal form of diploma inflation and widespread underemployment. Approximately 25% of graduates aged 23 to 35 are currently working in roles that are significantly below their education level. This is not just a matter of low pay, it is a fundamental misalignment of skills. When there are too many master's degrees, the doctoral degree becomes the new baseline for mid-level administrative roles. We see this in the experience of Zephyr Cao, who obtained a master's degree from the prestigious China Foreign Affairs University. He represents the peak of the academic construction project, yet he found that the market value of his advanced degree was almost identical to what he would have earned with a simple undergraduate credential 4 years earlier. He is caught in a state of degree inversion, where higher qualifications fail to translate into higher pay or status, rendering his years of extra study an expensive commodity with no buyer. For those who do find work, the reality is often a form of downward compatibility that borders on the absurd. The story of Amada Chen, a traditional Chinese medicine graduate, illustrates the toxic nature of the current entry-level market. After sending out over 130 resumes, she found herself in a sales role at a state-owned enterprise, working 12-hour days for a daily wage of 60 yuan, roughly $8. This was not a career. It was a form of disposable labor that utilized none of her medical training. The psychological toll of this mismatch eventually led her to consider a pivot into modeling, a career path that requires none of the academic rigor she spent years perfecting, but offers a more viable living wage. Her story is a vivid example of how the education system produces specialized talent for an economy that currently only has room for generalist, low-wage service workers. This human capital waste is even more pronounced among those who have sought elite international credentials. Lucas, a Yale-educated master's student fluent in 3 languages, returned to China with the expectation of entering the upper echelons of the professional world. After sending 500 resumes and facing a collapsed job market, he found himself working part-time in a flower shop for 3,000 yuan a month. He is a finished building with a world-class quality control certificate, yet in the current economic climate, there is simply no one to rent the space he occupies. His presence in a low-skill service role is a stark indictment of the education for prosperity model. When a Yale degree leads to a flower shop, the logic that fueled decades of family investment begins to disintegrate. The tragedy of this generational stall is that it represents a massive loss of potential for the nation's future. While the push for new quality productive forces aims to move the economy toward high-tech manufacturing and innovation, these sectors require a very specific, elite set of skills. They do not create the mass employment needed by the millions of humanities, social science, and business graduates produced by the university system. These young people are the overeducated and underemployed, a generation built for a service sector boom that has transitioned into a high-tech bottleneck. As the labor market continues to shift toward gig work and high-end tech, the millions caught in the devaluation trap are left to navigate a world that feels increasingly indifferent to their struggle. They are the products of an era of unprecedented educational expansion that has met an era of economic consolidation. The structural mismatch between what the education system produces and what the economy requires has created a sense of generational waste that is now being debated in every corner of the digital and physical world. This economic reality raises a deeper question. If the degree is no longer a shield against poverty, what happens to the identity of the person who was told their entire value resided in their academic success? Chapter 4. The Psychological Rot, when the spark becomes a shell. The word rotten is a violent descriptor for a human life. In its original linguistic home, it refers to organic matter in a state of decay, fruit that has gone soft, wood that has lost its strength, or a building that has been abandoned to the elements. To take this term from the graveyard of failed real estate and slap it onto a breathing, dreaming young person is a cultural act of profound cruelty. The rise of the Rotten Tail Kid label has sparked a fierce debate across Chinese society, forcing a confrontation between those who see it as a realistic description of a generation's plight and those who view it as a toxic, even poisonous assault on the human spirit. At the heart of this debate is a fundamental question. When a project fails, is it the materials that are at fault, or was the blueprint impossible from the start? This linguistic migration is viewed by some as more than just a trend. It is a symptom of a historical trajectory of systemic failure. The activist Chen Guangcheng has argued that the term is the latest evolution in a history of policies and social structures that end up harming the country and the people. He draws a direct line from the broken mountains and rivers, the environmental devastation wrought by decades of unchecked industrial growth, to the rotten-tailed children of today. In this view, the label is not an indictment of the youth, but a confession of a failed social contract. It suggests that the state and the family, having exhausted the natural resources of the land, have now begun to exhaust the human potential of the next generation, leaving behind a landscape of unfinished lives. Building on the developer mindset discussed in Chapter 2, Professor Chen Hui argues that the label is toxic because it treats a human life as a failed civil engineering project. Life, he insists, is not a piece of infrastructure. You cannot build a human being according to a rigid set of blueprints and expect them to be delivered like a finished apartment complex. By using the language of the construction industry to describe the development of a child, society is committing a category error. A building is a static object that exists to fulfill a specific commercial function. A child is a dynamic, organic life that grows according to its own internal logic and rhythm. When we call a child rotten-tail, we are essentially saying that if they do not produce a specific economic return by a certain date, their entire existence is a waste. The toxicity of the label is most apparent when applied to those who were once considered the perfect projects. Perhaps no case study illustrates the late-stage rot of a high-investment human project better than that of Zhang Xinyang. Once hailed as a national prodigy, Zhang was a university student at 10 and became the youngest PhD candidate in China at the age of 16. He was the ultimate finished building, constructed with the finest materials and the most intense academic pressure. Yet at 28, the project has stalled in a way that haunts the public imagination. Zhang has no stable job, very little in his bank account, and continues to rely on his parents for financial support. He has publicly stated that sitting around and doing nothing is the key to lifelong happiness, a sentiment that feels like a structural collapse to a society that invested so much in his potential. Zhang is not rotten because he lacks ability. He is rotten-tail because he has reached the end of the blueprint and found nothing there that he wants to inhabit. His story reveals that even the most successful academic construction can result in a shell that is uninhabitable for the person living inside it. The psychological toll of being labeled a failed product is visible in the stories of those who were once the crown jewels of their families. Consider the story of the student who seemed to have everything society demanded. He was over 1.8 meters tall, handsome, polite, and academically successful. He was the student union president in his second year of graduate school and a member of the Communist Party. To any observer, he was a high-quality building nearing completion. But the pressure of the civil service exams, combined with the crushing weight of his mother's expectations, eventually caused a structural collapse. He began to suffer from severe insomnia and eventually experienced a psychotic break in the school library, shouting and hallucinating. He was diagnosed with a mix of mania and depression. When he returned from the hospital, the Ling Qi, the spark of life and vitality in his eyes, was gone. He became wood-like, or men, a shell of his former self, now living at home on medication. In the cold logic of the term, he is a rotten-tail kid, but his story reveals that the rot was caused by the excessive weight of the expectations placed upon him. The loss of Ling Qi is the true tragedy. The spark was extinguished by the very process meant to make it shine. Similarly, the case of Han Taiyang serves as a cautionary tale of elite rot. Born into a family of high achievers, his father an agricultural scientist and his mother a biology expert, he was raised as a superchild. He was admitted to the prestigious Tsinghua University and later went to New York University for graduate school. He had the best materials and the most expensive construction team any child could ask for. Yet, internally, he rebelled against the constant competition. The conflict between his desire for a simple life and his parents' demand for elite success led to a mental breakdown and a stay in a psychiatric hospital. Today, he drives a taxi and plays in a band, a life that his parents view as a total failure of their investment. To them, he is an unfinished project, but to him, he is finally trying to live a life that isn't a blueprint. He has traded the finished status of an elite professional for the unfinished freedom of an individual. To counter the toxicity of the rotten label, some educators are turning to academic frameworks like Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. This theory argues that the traditional focus on linguistic and logical mathematical intelligence, the primary metrics of the Chinese education system, is far too narrow. Gardner suggests that humans possess a range of intelligences, including musical, spatial, bodily kinesthetic, and interpersonal skills. From this perspective, the rotten tail label is a failure of measurement, not a failure of the person. A child who is unfinished in the labor market might be finished or even flourishing in their interpersonal relationships, their artistic expression, or their physical mastery. By using a single economic metric to judge the completion of a life, society ignores the organic diversity of human potential. The rot is only visible if you are looking through a very specific and very limited lens. The toxicity of the label is further complicated by the cultural shadow of Kong Yi-ji. This character from early 20th century literature, a failed scholar who wore the long robe of the literati but was forced to steal to survive, has become a powerful metaphor for the modern graduate. Young people talk about the long robe of their degree as something they cannot take off. They feel that their education has given them a status that makes manual labor feel like a humiliation, yet the economy offers them nothing else. This is the psychological trap of the rotten tail kid. They are overeducated for the available jobs, but underprepared for the psychological reality of a stalled life. The label rotten tail reinforces this sense of being a high-status object that has become useless. It tells them that their long robe is just a shroud for a dead career. When young people fully internalize the rotten tail label, they often fall into a state of self-blame or total withdrawal. In a society where systemic critique is often discouraged or dangerous, it is safer to turn that frustration inward. They blame their own lack of effort, their choice of major, or their inability to network. This self-blame is the true internal rot. It leads to a sense of nihilism, where the individual stops trying because they believe the project is already over. The term rotten tail provides a convenient, if devastating, label for this state of mind. It allows the individual to stop struggling against a system that feels rigged against them. Some writers argue that the term reflects a deeper failure of population and fertility policies. They suggest that the state encouraged families to invest everything into a single child, creating a high-pressure environment where there was no room for error. When that single child fails to meet the economic expectations of the family and the state, the entire structure of social reproduction feels like it is falling apart. The rotten tail kid is the end result of a policy that treated people as demographic variables to be managed rather than as citizens with diverse needs and aspirations. From this perspective, the rot is a systemic issue that has finally reached the individual level, a consequence of treating human beings as tools for national development rather than as the purpose of it. The debate over the label is also a debate about the definition of success. The rotten tail metaphor assumes that there is only one way to finish a life, with a high-paying, high-status job. But as more young people find themselves in this stalled state, some are beginning to challenge this definition. They are looking for ways to find meaning outside of the traditional professional track. This is the counter-narrative to the rotten tail label. It suggests that a life is never truly unfinished as long as the person is still learning and growing. As one netizen wrote, "As long as you are still growing, how can your life be called rotten tail?" Yet the power of the label remains because it is tied to the reality of the stomach. You can redefine success all you want, but you still need to pay rent and buy food. For the millions of graduates living on their parents' pensions or working 12-hour days for 60 yuan, the term rotten tail isn't a philosophical debate. It is a description of their daily lived experience. It captures the feeling of being stuck in a concrete shell, waiting for a future that may never be built. The toxicity of the label comes from its accuracy in describing the feeling of being wasted. It reflects a world where the most valuable resource, human potential, is being left to rust in the rain. The social acceptance of this term also reveals a shift in the collective consciousness. In earlier years, such a term might have been suppressed or dismissed as a fringe complaint. Its mainstream popularity suggests that the sense of crisis has reached a tipping point. It is no longer possible to ignore the fact that millions of young people feel that their lives have been derailed. The debate over whether the label is toxic or realistic is, in many ways, a debate about whether society is willing to face the reality of its own structural failures. To call a child rotten tail is a cry of despair from a family that followed all the rules and still ended up with nothing. This internal struggle between self-blame and systemic critique is creating a generation that is deeply skeptical of the old promises. They are the first generation to grow up with the Internet and a global perspective, yet they find themselves more constrained than their parents were. They are the most educated generation in history, yet they are being told to lower their expectations and accept a life of downward compatibility. This is the existential rot that the term taps into. It is the feeling that the best years of their lives were spent building a structure that has no place in the current world. As the digital diaries continue to pile up and the pre-dawn crowds at labor markets grow younger, the debate over the rotten tail kid will only intensify. It is a debate that goes beyond economics into the very heart of what it means to be a person in a society that values you primarily as an economic unit. The term is a mirror, and what it reflects is a society that has become so focused on the building that it has forgotten about the people who are supposed to live inside. This realization is leading many young people to a crossroads, where the choice is between continuing to see themselves as a failed project or finding a way to tear down the blueprints and start over on their own terms. If the old blueprints are indeed the source of the rot, what new structures will this generation choose to build in their place?
Chapter 5. The Gardener's Pivot, Reclaiming Life from the Blueprint.
The shift away from the developer mindset often begins in the quietest corners of the Chinese home. It starts when a parent looks at their child and sees not a ledger of expenses and future dividends, but a person whose spirit is visibly fraying under the weight of an impossible blueprint. In the wake of the generational stall, a new type of parent is emerging, the Danren, or the bland parent. This is not indifference in the sense of neglect, but a radical protective detachment from the high-stakes world of Jiwa. The Danren represents a specific personality trend toward a calm, bland existence, a refusal to be provoked by the frantic competition that defined the previous decade. These parents have watched the skyscrapers of their neighbors' ambitions stall at the 50th floor, and they have decided to stop building. Instead of pouring more capital into a cooling market, they are prioritizing the child's mental health, physical vitality, and internal sense of self. This transition is often marked by a fundamental repurposing of the family's return on investment logic. We see this in the powerful choice offered by a mother in Tianjin to her high school senior. Faced with the prospect of the final academic sprint, she gave her son a choice. Spend 150,000 yuan on 1 year of intensive, high-pressure tutoring, or take that same 150,000 yuan to start a small business if he felt the pressure was too much. This is the ultimate gardener mindset. It acknowledges that the soil of the traditional exam system may no longer be fertile and offers the child the resources to plant themselves in a different field entirely. It moves the capital from a speculative academic bet to a tangible life experiment. In other cases, the pivot involves a strategy known as G, or chickening yourself. Rather than injecting their children with more tutoring, some middle-class parents are spending 300,000 to 500,000 yuan to obtain a master's degree themselves in Hong Kong. This is a calculated move to secure residency, which eventually allows the child to take the Huaqiao, or Overseas Chinese, exam, a significantly less competitive track to top-tier universities. By chickening themselves, parents are absorbing the labor and the cost of the system's hurdles, effectively clearing a path for their children to live a less burdened life. It is a repurposing of the family's resources to buy back the child's time and mental well-being. This shift from buying success to building internal grit is also changing how parents view the daily habits of their children, as seen in the previously mentioned example of Wang Nan's daughter using a washing board. It suggests that the value of the child is not found in the prestige of the school they attend, but in the strength of the character they develop through simple physical labor. For many families, this transition is born of necessity. When the financial traps of the middle class become unsustainable, the family is forced to rediscover what they value when the traditional markers of success are gone. This is where the arrangement of the full-time child is being reframed as a period of recovery. These young people are finding that while they may be stalled in the eyes of the GDP, they are essential to the emotional fabric of their families. The digital world is providing the infrastructure for this new identity. On platforms like Xiaohongshu, the unemployment blogger has become a voice for this transition. He Ajun, a 32-year-old former private tutor whose industry was dismantled by regulatory changes, documents her journey as a freelancer and street stall owner. She sells handicrafts and offers career consulting, earning a fraction of a corporate salary but calling herself a free worker. By sharing the reality of her life, including the small creative victories and the lack of shame, she is helping to deconstruct the stigma of the stalled project. She and others like her are showing that there is a second life after the blueprint fails, one built on skills the education system never taught. How to market oneself, how to build community, and how to find joy in the trash time of a cooling economy. This move towards skill-based fulfillment is leading some graduates to look toward the very manual labor their parents once tried to protect them from. There is a growing recognition that while the market for generalist office workers is saturated, there is a genuine shortage of high-skilled talent, such as welders, technicians, and specialized craftsmen. For a generation raised to believe that manual work was a sign of failure, choosing a vocational path is an act of rebellion. We see this in the story of a student who, after years of academic struggle and parental pressure, found his calling in a car repair shop. He told his former teachers that he was finally happy because he was solving real problems with his hands, rather than trying to please a system that didn't want him. The pinnacle of this path is perhaps best illustrated by the story of Kai Yazhou. Once labeled a common kid within the rigid academic hierarchy, Kai rejected the limitations of that label and pivoted toward a mastery of craft. By focusing on the tangible art of baking rather than the pursuit of traditional credentials, he eventually won a world gold medal. His success serves as a powerful reminder that the common label is often a failure of the system's imagination, not the child's potential. This return to the physical world, to mechanics, to baking, to gardening, is a way of reclaiming human value from the abstractions of the degree market. The cultural conversation is also being influenced by a shift in how success is portrayed in popular media. The idea of the audience member as a valid life choice is gaining traction. In the film Good Things, a young girl named Wang Molly tries to learn the drums at her mother's urging, only to realize that she actually prefers being in the audience. This resonates deeply with young people who feel they have spent their lives on a stage they never asked to be on. They are realizing that being an ordinary person, someone who works a modest job, has a healthy body, and a kind heart, is not a consolation prize. It is a difficult and worthy achievement. This is the healthy small grass philosophy, the belief that not every plant needs to be a giant redwood to be valuable. A meadow of healthy grass is just as essential as a forest of tall trees. This psychological pivot is also a form of collective healing. By identifying as part of a stalled generation, young people are essentially forming a union of the unfinished. They are using their shared experiences to find each other and to say, out loud, that the system's failure is not their personal fault. This collective exposure is reducing the stigma that used to lead to structural collapses and mental breakdowns. When the digital space is filled with stories of rejection letters and low-wage probationary periods, the individual sense of being a failed product begins to evaporate. It is replaced by a shared understanding that they are living through a period of profound economic transition. The reclaimed value of the ordinary is also visible in the way young people are spending their time. Instead of expensive status-seeking activities, they are finding meaning in city walks, in visiting local museums, and in simple social gatherings. They are practicing a form of consumption that is about experience and connection rather than status. This is the lifestyle of the Narration generation. They are opting out of the arms race of the middle class and finding that life is surprisingly rich when you aren't constantly trying to justify your cost of construction. They are discovering that the best parts of being human, curiosity, empathy, and creativity, don't require a million-yuan investment to flourish.
This cultural shift is forcing a re-evaluation of the social contract itself. If the old path of education for prosperity is broken, the answer seems to be a more diverse, less centralized definition of achievement. Young people are starting to value autonomy and flexibility over stability and status. They are looking for work that allows them to maintain their mental health and their personal interests, even if it means a lower social standing. They are becoming the architects of their own lives, tearing down the old blueprints and building something smaller, more modular, and more resilient. They are learning to live in the concrete shells of the old system while they wait for the new one to emerge. The stories of those who have navigated this transition offer a glimpse into a potential future. These are lives that are being repurposed, the human equivalent of an industrial warehouse being turned into an art gallery or a community center. The original purpose of the structure may have failed, but the space itself remains full of potential. As the record-breaking numbers of graduates continue to enter the labor market, the tension between the old expectations and the new reality will remain. But the emergence of these new identities suggests that the culture is beginning to develop the psychological tools necessary to survive the stall. The focus is slowly moving away from the ROI of parenting and toward the intrinsic value of the person. This is a slow and often painful process, as it requires letting go of decades of cultural conditioning. But in the silence of the unfinished projects, a new kind of conversation is beginning, one that is less about the height of the building and more about the quality of the life being lived inside it. The transition from being an asset to being a human is the true work of this generation, as they find ways to thrive in a world that no longer follows the old blueprints. The rotten tail kid phenomenon is more than a viral label. It is a mirror reflecting the structural cracks in the promise of education-led mobility. It reveals a generation caught between the high capital blueprints of their parents and an economic landscape that no longer has room for their specialized dreams. Yet, as the developer mindset fails, a new path emerges, one where success is redefined not by market value, but by internal resilience and the courage to be ordinary. This generational stall forces us to confront a profound truth. A human life is not a speculative asset, and its value cannot be measured by a diploma alone. As young people begin to reclaim their identities from these broken blueprints, they remind us that being unfinished is not a failure, but an opportunity to build something more authentic. If the old foundations have crumbled, what will we choose to build next? Thank you for listening.